Last time around we spoke of Soul Reaver, the first and most successful game in the Crystal Dynamics entries for the Legacy of Kain series. So now we move to its sequel, a critical tile in the overall narrative, one that does a lot of the heavy lifting required for it all to work, putting all the pieces on the board and providing the connective tissue for the series, Soul Reaver 2. As always, this is a deep dive into elements of the Legacy of Kain series, so there will be spoilers. And if you like any part of this video, please consider liking it, giving it a share, and subscribing. It's free, but it does help me a ton. Now, as always, we begin with a little history lesson. Even before the release of Soul Reaver, Crystal Dynamics already had the plan for a continuation, even though its concept wouldn't materialize until much later, given all the plot and design changes required for Soul Reaver. Not only that, but it was also decided there would be two ongoing Legacy of Kain series. The first being Soul Reaver, dealing with Kain and Raziel's conflict and the aftermath of the Vampiric Empire, and the other comprised of sequels to Blood Omen, telling the story of Kain's rise to power. Blood Omen 2 is part of that second sub-series, and it started development while the first Soul Reaver was still in production, or wouldn't release until after Soul Reaver 2. Not only that, but the contradictions in its scenario, specifically characters that shouldn't have been there, created problems for Soul Reaver 2's design and narrative, forcing Amy Hennig to do something of a deep dive into time travel fiction and lore to create a secondary plot that would begin to explain these inconsistencies. The development for Soul Reaver 2 was originally done for the PlayStation and Dreamcast, but at some point those versions were cancelled in favor of a PlayStation 2 release. With that said, Soul Reaver 2's development team barely had 17 months to complete the game, once again forcing them to pick their battles and cut many elements out of the final product, including several new Reaver enhancements, a replacement or new version of the glyph system from Soul Reaver, and a fully realized expansive version of Janos Audron's home of Ustenheim. While Amy Hennig was still very much in charge of writing the scenario, comic writer Paul Jenkins was brought in to polish the script. While the themes and inspirations for Soul Reaver are very much still present in Soul Reaver 2, Amy Hennig wanted the sequel to focus on a couple of key items. First, the question, can you change history? If so, what does it mean in terms of repercussions and your responsibility over them? And secondly, the notion that the only way the hero can succeed is by making their own path. The works of Joseph Campbell and their themes of transformation through adventure and trials were a key source for inspiration on this point. And beyond the themes, the other core intent for Soul Reaver 2 was to bring back the mythos of Blood Omen, using past characters and events to set the stage for Raziel's continued journey. Soul Reaver 2 was conceived to be a much more narrative and cinematic experience with greater emphasis on the story, which is why it doesn't follow the reach the end of the level and fight a boss structure of its predecessor. In fact, other than the enemies at the very end, which are only technically bosses, Soul Reaver 2 only has basic enemy fights. In terms of the music, Kurt Harlan and Jim Hedges returned, with Hedges now also contributing to the composition of the different tracks, once again making them adaptive with multiple versions that play based on gameplay triggers. For voice acting, Soul Reaver 2 brings back Paul Lukather to play Vordor, and much like Michael Bell joined the cast in Soul Reaver playing Raziel, Soul Reaver 2 has another newcomer, the man, the myth, and the legend that will never be forgotten, René Auberjonois as Janos Audron. Soul Reaver 2 released in 2001 to positive reviews, with critics praising the narrative and writing, though it was criticized for once again not having a conclusive ending and lacking some replay value, given that the upgrades are mandatory and there's really no side content. As I said before, the team had to cut a lot of elements from the game. The story required several revisions as well, much like its predecessor. And in the end, as lead designer Richard LeMarchand said, Soul Reaver 2 didn't reach the potential the team originally envisioned, especially in terms of puzzles, combat, and that ending. Now, without further ado, we dive into the time streams of Nosgoth's past and future and follow Raziel on Soul Reaver 2. Soul Reaver 2 opens with a cinematic version of the final boss fight of the previous game, with a more concise version of Kain and Raziel's exchange, focusing in particular to Raziel's mistaken or misguided notion that the Seraphim were noble and altruistic. Kain corrects him and clarifies that their ultimate goal, their agenda, was the same as that of the vampires. The dialogue also points to Kain delving deep into the mysteries of time travel and the timeline itself. And so our game truly begins with Raziel landing in that liminal place, with Mobius welcoming him. But as the smoke clears, it shows this is not some form of limbo suspended in time, but a smaller time-streaming chamber. One that opens to the very room where Vorador once decimated members of the Circle of Nine. Mobius comments on how, though "where am I" is the usual question, "when" might be more accurate in Raziel's case. Raziel attempts to raise the Soul Reaver blade to threaten Mobius, only for his staff to disable it. And this is one of the first additions to the character as compared to his portrayal in Blood Omen and even Soul Reaver, the staff. Before, a simple stick with an orb at the top, it's now given a snake-like design, evocative of that forgotten city that would at some point become the Abyss and the Lake of the Dead. The staff hinders vampires and their abilities and gives Mobius' vampire hunters a clear edge over their prey. I think it's meant to help explain how they could manage to hunt down and capture Vorador, or that public execution in Blood Omen. After all, if you remember that episode in the retrospective, I mentioned that to pass through all the traps and enemies in Vorador's manor, you'd require a rather unique set of skills, but if you can disrupt anything vampiric thrown at you and then disable the ancient vampire himself, then the thing is far more plausible than Mobius simply throwing a bunch of mercenaries at him, which is what Blood Omen would have you believe. Raziel pushes Mobius against the wall, and the Time Streamer is quick to resort to that submissive tone, meaning to appease and fool, similar to how he did in Blood Omen when speaking to William the Just, and I love every moment of Richard Doyle playing Mobius. He's just so perfect at playing in the snake. Raziel isn't convinced by Mobius' tone and tells him to drop the act, and maybe that he should kill the Time Guardian. Mobius does as requested, and with a grin tells Raziel that maybe he should, but he doesn't. And that's the critical point here. He doesn't say you won't, he says you don't. A matter of fact. As he states, the honor of his death belongs to Kain 30 years from this time. Claiming his role grants him a level of omniscience. That time span he mentions is critical, putting this period as the time when Ariel is murdered. And that leads me to the first of some of the enhancements to the mythos that Soul Reaver 2 introduces. Blood Omen presents Mobius as having the power to travel in time and forecast history, essentially having a view on the future. And the Silicon Knight's guide describes him as devious and conniving even before the corruption, but still benign. His role as the Oracle seen as helpful. Soul Reaver 2, in this very moment, expands his power set to a level of omniscience over the time stream, meaning he's aware of all events. And that could go to explain why Mobius in Soul Reaver 2 and beyond is malicious in every time period. The corruption taking hold very much retroactively through the overview of the timeline. Or it could be the corruption just made him worse, in terms of the negative aspects of his personality. The third option, though, is that the corruption did very little to alter him. His marching orders always coming from the Elder God and him already a rotten apple. And of course, the next item in this expansion of the mythos comes when he tells Raziel that he knew him when he was a member of the Sarafan, and that they were even close, and how hurt he is at what Kain has done to Raziel. Of course, the Wraith doesn't believe a single word, but the key point is that this establishes the longevity of those bound to the pillars, as this would make Mobius centuries old. This was even a point of heavy discussion in the old Eidos interactive forums, with Amy Hennig stepping in and confirming the extreme longevity aspect of the guardianship. Entering the room where the slaughter of the Circle took place, we see murals depicting that event, and Raziel asks if this is in fact the fortress of the Sarafan. Mobius confirms it, but admits this is not as kind a time period, and that the days of the Sarafan are long gone. But he and his mercenary army keep the fight alive. The conversation then shifts to Vorador and his assault on the Circle, with Mobius calling him
the most depraved and decadent example of his whole degenerate race.
And if we look back at Blood Omen and the lavish manner, the decadent part is certainly apt. Vorador killed 6 Guardians, which given the aforementioned longevity, would mean we add Mobius to the list of survivors, not just Mortanius and Malik, as seen in Blood Omen's opening. Raziel once again shows reluctance in believing Mobius' words. In this case, just because of the sheer convenience that Mobius somehow managed to not be there at the time of Vorador's attack. After all, he says,
"You have a reputation for deceit."
That very much precedes him. The Time Streamer demands to know who slandered him, this time adopting a tone of, let's face it, mock outrage. asking if it was Kain, the person who attacked Raziel and hurt him, and who is their common enemy. He asks Raziel to consider the source before judging him, and then immediately and rather dismissively changes the topic to the matter of Kain himself, and how Raziel can leave rekindling their past friendship for later, but should still work together, that he can help Raziel in killing Kain. Raziel tells the older man not to get involved, so despite his little schemes, he's simply out of his depth on this one. Here, Mobius takes on a very serious tone and tells Raziel not to underestimate him. And this conversation is great because you can see that Raziel's continued dismissal of Mobius as a threat is getting under the Time Guardian's skin. And the "do not underestimate me" Raziel is very threatening. Mobius shows a vision of Kain at the pillars, urging Raziel to head there and confront his victimizer. Raziel is surprised to see the pillars standing, and Mobius gives him a bit of lore on it, how they're the embodiment of the divine force that sustains Nosgoth, which sounds like him drawing a connection between the pillars and the Elder God, which is not surprising. Then, because Mobius can't stop himself from being manipulative, he tells Raziel that though he may never be human again, he can reclaim his humanity and his Sarafan nobility by going to the pillars and ending Kain's life. But of course, first he'll need to leave the fortress, and with the cruelest of grins, Mobius tells Raziel before vanishing to thin air that if he needs to kill the mercenaries in his way, then so be it. After all
great movements require a few martyrs.
Raziel takes a look around and notices another time-streaming chamber, this one marked with a gem he has no idea how to use. Upon leaving the room, he's attacked by one of the mercenaries, so it's time to talk a bit about Soul Reaver 2's combat. You see, in place of Soul Reaver's bosses, Soul Reaver 2 often locks you into arenas to fight common enemies, in the same style commonly seen in spectacle fighter games. Problem is, the combat is not that entertaining, and it's primarily because enemies can stand there blocking forever, almost always forcing you to use the very annoying and new heavy attacks. And I say they're annoying because many of them push your enemy away, so you're constantly running after them. It would have been a much better combat loop if heavy attacks just broke their defense instead. The only alternative is to run around and attack wildly when coming close to enemies, aka the Soul Reaver one way. Raziel, following Mobius' instructions, makes a few new martyrs and arrives at the chapel, and through a gated area finds himself in William the Just's mausoleum, wherein rests his body and his broken Soul Reaver. Raziel gives a quick recap of the character and his story and how Mobius coerced Kain into killing him. And it's a curious phrasing because in Blood Omen, though Mobius, as the Oracle, mentions the Nemesis and King Otmar, it's Ariel who puts Kain on the path to vanquishing the Tyrant, which would ultimately lead him to the path to kill William. Then again, the entire situation, from William's turn to tyranny to warning William of the vampire assassin coming after him, to even, quite likely, putting the Soul Reaver and the time-streaming device in Kain's path, was all a plot by Mobius, orchestrated to perfection. So in a sense, yes, you could say Mobius coerced Kain. The presence of this time-flung version of the blade gives Raziel a sense of vertigo and is shown, quite cleverly, by having the background and only the background shake and heave. As Raziel comes close to the blade, the Wraith Blade wraps itself around its corporeal form. And in touching the older version of itself, the spirit in the blade, the twisted and tormented version of Raziel fully awakens, and its hunger won't be denied any longer. It drains Raziel's energy to restore the broken sword and forces Raziel to take it up, not allowing him to drop it. Raziel holding two versions of the blade at the same time is a walking paradox, and thus capable of destroying any and all established history and change the timeline as he sees fit. Not that he knows it, still unaware that history is immutable unless a paradox is introduced. Mobius shows up, and Raziel demands to know if he's responsible for this sudden twist in the Soul Reaver's nature, threatening him with the combined blades. So of course, he attempts to direct Raziel towards Kain, partially out of sheer terror. With the blades in hand, Raziel could very well upend the order of things and kill Mobius ahead of time. But also because it's Mobius and he can't stop himself, he has to attempt to manipulate things. After all, Raziel is outside of Mobius' perception, as stated in Defiance. He can only see the ripples of his actions, so he probably sees the continued attempts at manipulation as a necessity. When Raziel throws Mobius' own words back at him, "Everybody dies," Mobius drops a little bombshell on Raziel.
Yes, the wheel of fate demands it.
and that they both serve the same god, the Elder God. Mobius then tries to use this fact to push Raziel further, claiming that as the god's agent of retribution, it's Raziel's mission to end Kain. To which the Reaver of Souls responds that he needs no other motivation than his own vengeance, and that now that he's seen that Mobius fears him, he doesn't need to bother with the Time Streamer anymore. Which if Kain were here, he'd tell Raziel not to underestimate Mobius. Don't discount him either. Hell, Mobius himself warns Raziel of this in their early conversation. You underestimate me. As Raziel leaves, Mobius closes the gate to William's mausoleum, and leaning on it admits that Raziel nearly had him, but that this was a one-and-done situation, that the Wraith would never get a second chance, and it's true. Now, with the blade fully aroused, as I mentioned, comes the main mechanic for Soul Reaver 2. Raziel can now turn the blade on and off, even if his health is not at maximum, but the Soul Reaver can now kill enemies outright and consume their souls, filling out a bar around the health spiral, starting out green and changing color all the way to red. At max, it produces a hissing sound and begins to drain Raziel's HP until the bar depletes, though the higher it is, the more damage the blade does, even outright one-shotting the most powerful enemies. On his way out, Raziel finds a stained glass showing Janos Audron, and he tells something of the vampire's lore that we know from even Blood Omen, that he's a legendary being reputed to being the most vicious diabolical vampire, that terrorized the people of the village below his mountain home, and that his heart was ripped from his body. The Heart of Darkness, a relic meant to restore vampiric unlife. But the key point of the cutscene is Raziel pondering on whether Janos was truly such a monster, or if it was truly just Sarafan propaganda, meant to make themselves seem saintly by demonizing their enemy. And it's the first instance of Raziel maybe even considering that the Sarafan may not be the good guys. And then swiftly putting that aside in the next room, the memorial to his human self and that of his brothers, the monument to this human counterpart, filling him with a sense of sadness and a rage for the indignity visited upon him. Even with a consideration for what the Sarafan could truly have been like and their association with Mobius, Raziel still has a romantic idealization towards his former self, and he's not ready to let that go yet. A few fights later, Raziel emerges from the fortress and both he and the player witness Nosgoth like never before. What it was like before the corruption and collapse of the pillars. Vibrant, verdant, beautiful, with clear blue waters flowing freely and life abundant. It's easy to think of this Nosgoth as innocent, especially given some of Kain's dialogue across the series, stating that he could never give Nosgoth her innocence back. But the truth is, this is already a Nosgoth that had its natural forces shifted and bound to the pillars by the ancient vampires as part of their war effort. Its innocence was lost long before Kain made his selfish choice. Swimming across the waters, Raziel comes to a wheel to open a sluice gate, and in doing so triggers the checkpoint mechanic for Soul Reaver 2, so that if you die, you return to the closest one. The only unfortunate thing is that this only applies to the current play session and is not really a save point. The fun thing is that they decided to have Raziel acknowledge both the checkpoints and the save points in the narrative, claiming that they drew some of the Soul Reaver's energy and saved an imprint of Raziel. I've always liked that, when narrative acknowledges purely mechanical things. In this lake, there is a door marked with what we'll learn is an elemental symbol for the Soul Reaver. Raziel makes note of this place and says right now he doesn't have the means to open it. And if there is one word that is overused in Raziel's vocabulary, it's means. You could almost make a drinking game out of it. Take a shot every time Raziel says he has or hasn't the means to do something. Problem is, he says it so much, it could be a dangerous drinking game. Nevertheless, Raziel pushes forward and swims to the other side of the walls, and here underwater there's a stone slab with a strange symbol on it that looks like the eyes of the Elder God. It's merely set dressing, but was intended to be the Spirit Forge entrance. Along the way to the pillars, Raziel witnesses the hunter's dirty work, with scores of impaled and destroyed vampires. He realizes they aren't like the monsters he left behind and are far more human in their appearance and clearly not the dominant force, but creatures mercilessly hunted down, repressed by their foes. And here comes a moment of either pure hypocrisy from Raziel or pure ignorance, or even aspects of that romanticized version of the Sarafan and their mission. He claims he still sees vampirism as a plague to be ended, but that this is just ruthless persecution. But to end the plague of vampirism, this is what it means. So Raziel can tell this is wrong, but is still so enamored with the ideal of a holy quest, of a noble crusade, and of the fact that his purity was tainted by vampirism, that he can't bring himself to fully condemn it. It would take him some time and a little more of this journey for him to realize this is nowhere near the ruthlessness of the Seraphin. Raziel gets to the pillars, and perhaps for the first time since Blood Omen, we get a glimpse of the original version of the pillars of Nosgoth, pristine and pure. And before I get any further, I'll just say very clear that this is both my favorite scene in all of Legacy of Kain and perhaps the most important. It sets the stage for everything that is to come and explains a lot of Kain's motivations and actions. Raziel attempts the stealthy approach, but Kain tells him, "I know you're there, Raziel." The Wraith tells Kain Mobius led him there, but that he should have guessed Kain would be waiting at the pillars. It is, after all, the place where Kain decided to execute him, and the place where they fought and the Reaver blade shattered. The pillars are important in their tale. Kain chuckles and gives a version of "if Mobius told you to jump off a bridge, would you?" and warns Raziel of Mobius's manipulations, telling him to stay away from the Time Streamer's net. Raziel dismisses Kain's words and tells him he's here to make him pay for his betrayal and to restore balance. Kain asks then, if that happens, whose desire is satisfied, Raziel or Mobius's? Raziel asks if he should instead allow himself to be manipulated by Kain, before telling his old master that the chase is over. Kain enlightens Raziel and tells him this is not a chase. They're supposed to meet here. This is part of their destinies. They were always meant to be here. And as a follow-up to his speech at the end of Soul Reaver on how he'd gained knowledge from looking through the streams of time, he says he's seen the entirety of their tale and it's a poorly written one, and that they need to rewrite the ending. Raziel is having none of it. He's had enough and demands Kain face him, claiming even he doesn't deserve a coward's death, to which Kain asks to be granted one last request, that being for Raziel to just listen what he has to say. He explains that this is a crucial point in history where Nosgoth is betrayed, the key moment that defines their entire story. This is the moment where Ariel is killed and Kain is being born, and as a great detail, the audio track has echoes of Ariel's dying scream to accentuate Kain's words. As she dies, Nopraptor finds her body, and filled with grief and paranoia, he plunges into a madness and uses it to infect the rest of the circle through their shared symbiotic link to the pillars. Basically, the premise for Blood Omen. And much like the opening of that game, we now see the pillars darken as they are corrupted. Raziel asks if he should show Kain the same mercy he showed the circle. After all, he did wipe them all out. From that point of view, Raziel says, Kain is merely the last man standing, and why condemn Raziel for simply finishing the job Kain was unable to? And now it's Kain that has had enough of Raziel's nonsense, and tells him to stop all the moral posturing. He's not here for balance or saving Nosgoth or any of that nonsense. He's here for revenge, for his own indignation. Kain knows it and he was counting on it. But he softens and tells his former lieutenant there's nothing wrong with hating. At least it's honest. Hate him, but do it honestly, no pretense. He explains the sacrifice presented to him were two sides of a coin. One side leads to ruin, as they have already experienced, and the other side leads to the end of the vampire race as orchestrated by Mobius. And again, something I mentioned in the Blood Omen retrospective. For this older Kain, the matter of vampire survival might be an important factor in hindsight, but I still firmly believe that the Kain of Blood Omen, that fledgling vampire, didn't give that bit two thoughts. He chose refusal for his own personal motivations. What those are, well, go check out that video. Raziel, hearing this, asks then if they agree that the restoration of the pillars is important, and Kain confirms it, to which the Wraith almost wearily points out that after this entire speech, is making Raziel's point for him. To end it all, for new Guardians to be born, Kain has to die, to which his quarry retorts that the pillars don't belong to humans, they belong to vampires. Raziel groans at Kain's arrogance, but the vampire chuckles and points out the third option, one hidden in Raziel's journey, but one that he'll have to figure out for himself. And this is an important thing, it's not just not telling you so there's the rest of the game to go through, but it's a thing of show, don't tell, or for Raziel, it's experience for yourself. Sometimes you can tell people everything they need, but until they face situations for themselves, they won't be ready to accept those words as a reality. And with Raziel's head so firmly lodged in his own vindictive Seraphim behind, he's not ready to hear this. He has to see it all for himself. Raziel, though, reminds Kain that he said there are only two options, two sides to that metaphorical coin. But Kain simply asks, before teleporting away, what happens if you throw a coin enough times and one day it lands on its edge? Raziel wonders why he listened, why he didn't just attack and kill him, and admits that despite everything, Kain's words intrigued him, and if there are secrets to find, he'll look for them. And you gotta love the designers. They also thoughtfully point the camera to the shift glyph present on a nearby stone pillar, as Raziel stands in front of an unclimbable surface with torches at the top. 3 guesses what you're supposed to do. I mean, it's great game design, pointing to what you need to move forward, but at the end of this important scene, it's just a bit too on the nose for me and makes me laugh every time. Raziel shifts and the wall becomes a stairway leading further in, and shifting back to the material world, Raziel notices ravens watching him, and he remarks that he's had the feeling of being observed for a while now. Close by, he finds a door, one of a kind briefly seen in Soul Reaver, but all over the place in this game and beyond. A Soul Reaver door, meant for the blade to act as a key. This one has an image of an ancient vampire, a blue-skinned winged being, one looking very much like Raziel does. With the Reaver used thusly, the door opens, leading to an underground chamber beneath the pillars. And here's a scene I have some issues with. I'll describe what happens and then I'll tell you what my problem is. As Raziel steps inside, he sees murals depicting the raising of the pillars, the end of the ancient war, and the sealing of the Hilden by the vampires. The pillars acting as their lock, the Reaver held high as a sacred artifact, and of course, the blood curse. But there is a voice speaking to Raziel, telling him everything shown in this chamber are lies, the delusions of an ancient dead race. The Elder God reveals himself to Raziel, and here he is manifest as he'd never been seen before. You see, in Soul Reaver he's a presence, only a pair of tentacles visible, but here we see his form more clearly, not just the writhing tendrils, but the many eyes it has. This exchange has Raziel acting ever more willful and insolent to the Elder God, who tries very much to steer him yet again to killing Kain, demanding it as Raziel owes him a debt. Raziel dismisses it, telling him that he never asked to be put back into this wretched, destroyed vessel he inhabits. The Elder God reminds him that he restored Raziel, but it was Kain who did the destroying of the vessel part, and yet Raziel stopped short of killing the vampire when he had the chance. He reminds Raziel, his servant, not to fail him. Raziel boldly claims he serves no one, not him, not Kain, and least of all Mobius, even going as far as taunt the Elder God, asking if Mobius would be as good a servant, as fervent a believer, if he knew he served a giant squid, which is a wonderful bit of foreshadowing for Defiance. The Elder God tries, during this entire exchange, to remain calm and reasonable, while attempting to move Raziel in the direction he wants. But it's clear the attitude bothers him, as his tone begins to get more and more aggressive as the conversation continues. The Elder God begs Raziel to not be deceived by Kain, who's a snake after all. But the Wraith retorts that everyone is trying to manipulate him, that he's just trying to look for the truth. To which the Elder God says, I can tell you the truth, the inexorable truth. The Wheel of Fate is truth. The cycle is truth. Death being inexorable is fact. And vampires are a plague on it. They prevent souls from keeping the wheel going, but it has to move. So it's Raziel's mission to restore it, to kill the vampires as his agent, as his Soul Reaver. But Raziel is still unmoved and says that though Kain deserves it, if and when he dies will be for Raziel himself to decide and for his own reasons. The Elder God makes one last attempt and it's a low blow, reminding him of how Kain used and discarded him, and to remember his rage, to let that guide his hand. I mentioned I had a problem with this scene, and it's Raziel's attitude towards the Elder God. Sure, is Mobius' master, and anyone associated with Mobius is suspect, by default. And Raziel in Soul Reaver does state, I am destroyed, looking at the body he's inhabiting. But at no other point in their shared history has Raziel taken this stone with the Elder God. I suppose this is one of those elements that made the developers claim the storytelling in Soul Reaver was a bit patchy, which in turn led them to be much more story-focused in Soul Reaver 2, seeing as that relationship didn't have much development in Soul Reaver 1. But Raziel comes to this scene already antagonizing the Elder God. It's not something that evolves, it's bad from the get-go. Even considering that from Raziel's point of view, the Elder God has been very much straight with him the entire time. His motivations have been consistent. Kill the vampires, kill Kain, the Wheel of Fate demands it for restoration. He's not yet aware of how much of a manipulator the Eldritch creature is. This cutscene gives him some of that knowledge, so his tone should have changed. He could have started cordial if distant, souring the more the Elder God pushes him to kill Kain. In the same way, Mobius just couldn't leave it alone. This way, you could definitely have Raziel end the conversation fully antagonistic, and his comment about Mobius serving a squid could have been him poking the bear out of annoyance. Raziel continues his journey, the next passage underwater, a series of caves that have you swimming perilously close to the Elder God. He's just part of the environment. He doesn't move, he doesn't do anything, but being so close to him always creeped me out. This passage leads to a swampy area, and the Ignis Fatuus lanterns tell you all you need to know. This is the Thermogen Forest and Swamp, aka the path to Vorador's Manor. In fact, upon turning a few corners, you can see the man himself spying on you from the distance, from something of a stony balcony, revealing the master of those ravens Raziel saw earlier. You also see another time-streaming chamber, this one locked behind a cracked stone gate. Your first instinct might be, oh, I'll use a force projectile, like in the first Soul Reaver, and that'll open it. But no, your force projectiles are actually useless for this, and in general. You need a special Reaver enhancement for it, the Air Reaver, which has the specific power of making your projectiles blow up these kind of cracked barriers. Exploring the swamp on his way to that balcony, Raziel notes a blocked path to the northern regions, making a trip there impossible for now. Upon reaching the balcony, he finds something else there, a Soul Reaver door. This one leading into the first forge, the Darkness Forge, where you imbue the Reaver with elemental darkness. And it's the first place to show you how puzzles have evolved. It's no longer just pushing boxes. Now you carry mirrors and other items, turn pillars around without using Constrict, which has been removed from Soul Reaver 2. I suppose even the developers realized Constrict sucked and was utterly pointless. Puzzles in Soul Reaver 2 are much more diverse than they were in the prior game. There is still some pushing around, but nowhere near as abundant as it was in Soul Reaver, nor is it exclusively boxes. There are pillars and other objects to move now too, thus pulling levers and other means of interaction. I quite like the puzzles in Soul Reaver 2, the air and fire forges having the best and most varied, and Janos' Retreat having a great set of puzzles that put all your abilities up to that point to the test. With a blade imbued with darkness, it's possible to open the door to the outside once more. Or you can enter with a base Reaver, but it requires the Dark Weaver to open it from the other side. The door bearing the crest of this element, just as the one outside the Sarafan Fortress, meaning that is your next stop. But before that, it's time to have a chat with Vorador, who's impressed that Raziel knows who he is, and jokingly asks if everything Raziel's heard is good. He asks what kind of creature Raziel is, clearly not human but also not a vampire, more demonic than anything else, wondering what his appearance means regarding the corruption of the pillars, distrustful given that he came out of the Sarafan Keep, aka Mobius' school for gifted youngsters. When Raziel tells him he doesn't understand what Vorador is talking about, he makes it plain. Are you the cause for the pillars' corruption or their salvation? To which Raziel responds, neither. Vorador then moves to another point, out of Raziel just bumbling around opening doors and uncovering secrets hidden and forbidden for centuries, saying only one being could do that, but realizing, looking at the creature before him, that Raziel doesn't know what he is or what he could be. But when prompted by the Wraith to enlighten him, Vorador dismisses it, claiming the world is beyond redemption and let the humans have it. Raziel is surprised that the Elder Vampire is just giving up on everything, but Vorador tells him it's from centuries of experience. He explains how centuries before, the Crusade of the Sarafan nearly wiped them from the map, and they murdered the most ancient of their kind, his maker and Reaver Guardian Janos Audron, and how now Mobius' mob is well on their way of completing the job, stating to Raziel, much like he did with Kain and Blood Omen, that it's simply not worth to meddle in the affairs of mortals. When Raziel asks about the secrets he's uncovered, the winged race, the Reaver, and the pillars, Vordor dismisses it as fairy tales and delusions by a race that held on to their traditions even after the world had forgotten them, fading from history until one remained, who kept going out of obligation and his unshakable faith. He's essentially giving you the 101 on Janos Audrin, which is relevant as he reveals to Raziel that the only person who could give him the answers is in fact that very same ancient vampire. But being long dead, Raziel and the world are both equally screwed. But knowing of time streaming chambers and being an actual time traveler, Raziel sees it another way. If Janos is the key to the truth, Raziel would travel to a time where he was still around and find him. Vordor meant to dash his hopes, but he did the opposite. The way back leads through the underground pillar chamber again, and another exchange with the Elder God, with Raziel taunting his master, claiming he's now likely uncovered more than the Elder God intended him to. And from the tone, it's clear the Elder God is reaching the limits of his patience, even as he tries to convince Raziel that the ruins are just this ancient race's delusions and their attempts to manipulate Raziel across time, warning him of the many forces bent on twisting Raziel's destiny, to which the Wraith replies,
I have no doubt of that. The question is, am I in their presence right now?
Just abandoning all pretense and straight up accusing the Elder God, which is close to the last straw for the Elder God as the creature becomes threatening, warning that disobedience would mean Raziel's end. But his Reaver of Souls doesn't take the word seriously, believing himself to be well out of the god's reach. An interesting thing is that at this point, it's the third time Raziel's been told that the stories in the murals are delusions of the ancient vampires. Vordor's claims on this are clearly out of spite, bitter about the past and his own history. But the Elder God, of course, are to attempt to convince Raziel that looking into the past, into Janos, is pointless. Now, the Reaver enhancements in Soul Reaver 2 are temporary. They disappear when Raziel shifts back and forth from the spectral realm, so they have to be re-imbued at elemental fonts that activate across Nosgoth along with the Forge. You use one of these fonts to re-imbue the Reaver with darkness when you reach the lake, passing under the gate and opening the way into the new ruin, learning inside that the crest above the door is the elemental symbol of light. And you see gems inside that match that of the time-streaming door inside the fortress, giving you a big hint of how you'll use this element. The Light Forge adds further complexity to the puzzles by having parts that require the use of the Dark Reaver, such as using it to create a bridge of shadows to climb to other areas. It also introduces elemental spirits. These creatures are first seen in the caverns under the pillars, which connect to the lair of the Elder God, just beings made of pure energy with a central spark or core in their bodies. In the different forges, we find similar creatures but made of the elemental energies themselves, and killing them enables elemental doors or even elemental fonts, and act as something of a combat challenge amid all the puzzles, along with, some undead warriors here and there. With a Reaver imbued with elemental light, Raziel opens the massive gate on the water leading straight into the fortress, where he fights his way back to the chapel and stepping through it, finds a guard drained of his blood, so he knows Kain is around, and finds him in William's mausoleum. And throughout this scene, we see that distortion of the paradox in the air, the background and floor just warping, and it only gets stronger. Kain says this is the critical moment, the point where their fate and history meet, and where they may reclaim their true destinies. Raziel, suspicious of Kain's motives, tells him the only thing he knows for certain is that Mobius and Kain have pushed him to this place at this time, so he can't trust either of them, and whatever game they're playing, it stops here. He's not going to dance to their tune anymore, walking his own path. Kain tells him it's not that simple, that it's no accident they're there, they've always met in this place, and this time gives Raziel a rundown of the rules of time. Time is immutable, and even being here doesn't mean Raziel and Kain have any hopes of changing it. They're insignificant in the face of time's flow. Even if they try to change something, like a river, time will simply flow around them and keep things as intended. But, Kain says, how does that explain William the Just? He gives Raziel a primer on the situation, how he saw the rise of William to power in his youth, how he became the nemesis, and so when the opportunity presented itself, he decided, in his wisdom, to go back in time and kill William before he could become the tyrant, not knowing that Mobius had orchestrated the entire affair, as I mentioned earlier. Kain kills him, and as a consequence of the public outrage of the vampire assassin, Mobius is able to launch his new crusade against vampire Kain. But how is that possible if history is so resilient? He finally puts it in front of Raziel. The answer is the Reaver, both warriors holding the blade. They're meeting in battle, a paradox and obstruction so powerful that history can't flow around it and instead has to find a new path, reshuffling events as needed. And in this moment, Kain presents Raziel the Reaver blade, and immediately the Wraith blade pulls at Raziel to meet its former self. Raziel demands to know if Kain is doing something to him, but Kain replies, "It's not me. All of this is you." And he assures Raziel he holds all the cards in this situation. Raziel threatens Kain, telling him if he's saying the truth, then he should be afraid, because Raziel can just kill him. And in yet another moment of clever wording, Kain replies,
"And so you do, Raziel."
Matter of fact, because this is the point in history, in this, let's call it original timeline, technically the second one, the first one being the timeline where William is the nemesis, but this is where Raziel kills Kain and is then consumed by the ravenous blade, closing the loop of his life. In fact, the pull of history, destiny, or merely the will of the Reaver are so strong that they pull Raziel towards Kain, nearly stabbing him, and the vampire drops to the floor and is there helpless, and tells Raziel if he truly believes in free will, he will not kill Kain, because if he does, they're both merely pawns in an artificial destiny created by Mobius, where Kain is incapable of assuming his guardianship and where Raziel can't become Nosgoth's savior. Raziel struggles against the pull of destiny, and Kain tells him to resist, that it's in him, the power to resist fate, because Raziel is in fact the only one with true free will. Raziel raises the blade and plunges it into William's grave, splitting it in half, and immediately everything shakes as history attempts to reshuffle, creating a third timeline, not the last one that will be created in this game. Kain tells him now it might still be possible for them to achieve their true destinies. For him, that being assuming the guardianship of balance and returning the pillars to vampires. Raziel, sounding tired, tells him he doesn't know what game he and Mobius are playing, but again, refuses to have anything to do with Kain's messiah complex. Kain bids Raziel to leave then and make his own way, finding his own truths and learning his own lessons, but to not forget that he's now a champion of free will, a destroyer of false histories, and to continue his pursuit of truth, that there is more for him to learn if he has what it takes to see it all through, before once again teleporting because Kain likes to have the last word in the conversation. Raziel fights his way to the room with the streaming chamber, opening it with the power of the Light Reaver, and sees Mobius approach, who demands to know why Raziel has not killed Kain, rebuffing the notion that it was an act of free will, saying Raziel's merely obeying Kain. Raziel reasserts that he's not Kain's servant or his or anyone's. Mobius pleads with him and tells him he has a mission. He's supposed to save Nosgoth, to which Raziel says he's A, tired of hearing the word savior, and B, not seeing much worth saving in Nosgoth. What he is interested in is traveling to another time period, and he forces Mobius to override the time streaming chamber to send him to the time before the Seraphim started their crusade. And honestly, for how insightful Raziel can be, here he's a complete moron, or even remotely thinking he could trust a snake like Mobius to operate the machine properly. It's another proof that whatever he may say, whatever claims of independence and free will he may possess, in the end, Raziel is just a pawn that thinks he's a player. Plus, he's been told twice not to underestimate Mobius, and does it again anyway. Mobius begs Raziel to reconsider, to go and kill Kain, but Raziel tells Mobius to do the deed himself if it's that important to him, and uses the time streaming chamber, landing in Nosgoth after the collapse of the pillars, realizing that Mobius had once again played him, something everyone else saw coming a mile away. The fortress is a dilapidated ruin, not a few steps out of the chamber, and his progress is barred by an energy field, and two green demons with blades for hands materialize. With the binding of the pillars broken, things from outside can now come in, and these are redesigns of the same demons we see in Avernus when Azimuth was summoning them all over the place in Blood Omen. Not only that, but a curious aspect of them is they have a cry that sounds like they're whispering Raziel. but in truth is a recycled bit of sound from the Turalim in the first Soul Reaver. The exact same sound. This is the era where Soul Reaver 2 throws you a major complication. Prior to this, when falling in battle and ending in the Spectral Realm, you can easily deal with the usual enemies and are generally safe. Except now, the demons also materialize in the Spectral Realm, meaning you can actually die in there. In fact, many a time did I start a battle in the material plane, lose my HP, and then continue fighting in the Ghost World. Demons in Soul Reaver 2 suck. They're awful. They deal humongous levels of damage, barely even flinch to your attacks, and are generally a nightmare to fight, and the only way to properly combat them is to simply let the Reaver gain power and erase them from the world. Only problem is that along the way you'll likely lose so much health that the Reaver will drain you fully and drop you to the Spectral Realm, or leave you so battered that the next thing will finish the job. Though my issues are only mechanical, but I love how they contribute to the world lore. Like I said, the collapse of the pillars now allows Hashtag Geek's compatriots to just come in force, and knowing what Raziel's aim is to ultimately restore the pillars, they desperately seek to stop his plans. Fighting his way to the chapel, Raziel sees a statue of Mobius holding Vorador's head and realizes the Time Streamer sent him over a century into the future, well past the conclusion of Blood Omen. And even though the Roman or Latin alphabet we all use is part of Nosgoth, if you remember the signs on the roads for Blood Omen, it's still jarring to see Requiescat in Pace in such a clean typeface on the base of the statue. There are no textures on it, no styling, it's pretty much Times New Roman, and it looks so thoroughly out of place. Continuing on, he eventually comes face to face with a Time Streamer, or a spiritual version it seems, who claims to be a martyred spirit and that his deceit is just one last valiant act for a doomed man. And how this future is Raziel's fault, implying its creation is tied to Raziel's decision to spare Kain. Of all of Mobius' attempts at manipulation, this is by far the weakest, and even Raziel quickly points out the flaw in the argument, given that this was created by Kain's original choice, and so killing his future self will have no impact on these events. Raziel surmises that Mobius is worried because Kain is a wildcard, and now that he survived, the Time Streamer can't tell what he's doing. Problem is, Raziel's wrong. It's not Kain who's the wildcard, it's him. Raziel continues to prove he's a paradox maker. Kain himself said it in the scene in the mausoleum. The whole affair hinged on Raziel's choices. After all, it's not Kain Mobius is attempting to manipulate, it's Raziel. Granted, with history rewritten after the paradox, the shuffle of history might be messing with Mobius' ability to perceive the timeline, and so he could be blind to future Kain's movements. But this is unlikely. Mobius demands Raziel leave him and torment his spirit no longer, but, unmoved, Raziel retorts that he has a way of testing if Mobius is actually a spirit, and partially removes his scarf to feed, but before anything can happen, Mobius disappears. Raziel, now trapped in this time, thinks to explore it, hoping to at least find a path to the mountains and learn more of Janos Audron. The future is a wet, rainy, miserable place, but it has a few interesting details. The first one is that in the lake outside the fortress, in the prior time period, you can see an abundance of fish swimming about. In this period, after the fall of the pillars, there are no fish. There's barely any wildlife around. The swamp is littered by mutant monstrosities, likely those created in the past in Dark Eden. There are also so many demons just popping out of nowhere or preventing your passage until you've defeated them, that it makes the future Soul Reaver 2's most difficult section to play through, by virtue of the sheer amount of these encounters. But to reach the mountains, Raziel must make two stops, and they're both more or less in the same place, one being the ground floor of the pillars, and the other the underground chamber. Coming to the pillars, Raziel notes that this is how he knew them, already torn, but this is still a fresh wound, so to speak, so he wonders if such devastation could truly be just because of Kain's choice, as he has a feeling that darker forces are at play. In this time period, Ariel is already haunting the pillars, and in case the player didn't go through Blood Omen, Ariel is here to deliver a convenient monologue explaining the entire ordeal. Raziel approaches and asks if Ariel's pain and rage will be lessened if, say, Kain's entire journey had been orchestrated by someone, and that whatever his choice at the end, it will be the same, perhaps with an even worse consequence if he had chosen death. Ariel doesn't take kindly to these hypotheses and says they don't absolve Kain, and that he must die to restore the pillars. So Raziel responds with a third possibility, that the world is simply already doomed and it's too late and Kain's death would do nothing at all, and that as a consequence, Ariel is stuck here forever. The mere thought sends Ariel running, disappearing from sight, or in Raziel's terms, fading into the spectral realm where he follows. Ariel begs Raziel for mercy to stop hounding her, and in a rather cruel parallel to his conversation with Kain, where Raziel threw Kain's own actions back at him, in that case the culling of the circle and how little mercy he showed them, Raziel here does the same, asking Ariel if he should show her the mercy she showed the rest of the circle when she sicked Kain on them, or the mercy she showed Kain by hiding the details of his fate, or even more, the mercy she gave her lover by making him the first to fall. If there is one thing we can say for sure about Raziel, is that he has a knack for low blows. That's his secret glyph power. Ariel begs to be left alone, and Raziel finally relents and tells her he only wants to find the truth. But before he leaves, he warns her that her stay at the Pillars has only just begun. Now, from that entire cutscene, Raziel makes a fascinating point, and that's the dark forces at work and the notion that maybe the game was rigged from the get-go. That Kain's choice at the end of Blood Omen was meaningless. Now, we know from Blood Omen that if he chooses to sacrifice himself, Nosgoth is restored. But I put to you this question: if Kain's death would have restored the Pillars, then why would the dark entity, Hashagik, attempt to kill Kain at the end of Blood Omen? Given that he was in possession of Mortanius' body and even interacted with Kain along the way, he must have known the fledgling vampire was the new Balanced Guardian. It makes no sense for him to kill Kain if his death would mean the entire plan goes away, unless Kain's demise, or continued existence, mattered very little. Another curious observation we can make is that Kain had already died in the opening of Blood Omen, so technically, the Pillar of Balance should already have been restored in the space between Kain's death and him taking Mortanius' bargain. Possibly there was no one born at the time to take guardianship from him. Nosgoth at the time of Blood Omen is certainly a place where more people get subtracted from the census rather than added to it. But also, Defiance tells us that when the vampires became immortal and human guardians started to appear, the ancient vampires turned the humans to vampires. And from Soul Reaver, we know that the vampires are created from corpses, so there has to be a mechanism in the Pillars that maybe restores guardianship if the dead guardian comes back as a vampire. But the question remains, if Kain's permanent death, true death, would restore the Pillars, why would Hashagik risk it? Raziel keeps moving and comes to the underground chamber, and the Elder God is displeased, calling Raziel a failed assassin. And this scene is curious, because we know the Pillars crack above ground, and more or less collapse under their own impressive weight. But underground, the scene almost looks like the Elder God toppled them. In fact, one of his tendrils is wrapped around one of the pillars. The Elder God, much like Mobius, not surprisingly, once again tries to guilt-trip Raziel, mentioning how the state of the world is Kain's fault and how it will remain so as long as he's alive. To which Raziel points out what I just did, that it really looks like the Elder God had a hand in cracking the pillars, while asking a very important question. Why is it that when Nosgoth is suffering, he seems to thrive? The Elder God goes on a tirade how he's the engine of life, the source of Nosgoth itself, the hub of the wheel of fate, and the devourer of death. And again, because Raziel loves a low blow, he retorts, or maybe you're just hungry, and finally makes the connection that perhaps this enemy of the vampires is in fact the biggest parasite. The Elder God threatens Raziel with a classic, I made you, I can destroy you. But Raziel rather smugly says that as the god's agent, he's beyond death, and he's reminded there are worse fates. In fact, the opening of Defiance shows such a fate, becoming trapped in the spectral realm with no way out. Raziel loses his temper and tells it like it is, that the Elder God is just another cancer in the world, a parasite burrowed deep in the heart of Nosgoth. The Elder God dismisses Raziel, telling him to go and play the rebel and find himself among the used and discarded. Just another fool, basically. But to never forget that whatever he does, he will always be the Elder God's instrument, his tool, his Soul Reaver. And I love that Raziel faces the camera the moment the Elder God says the words Soul Reaver. This cutscene is the first time it's explicitly stated that the Elder God is just another parasite, just another form of vampire. And if you take the Devourer of Death aspect of his spiel and the fact he calls himself the center of the cycle of death and rebirth, it's easy to make the connection that much like Raziel, the Elder God feeds on souls. This will be further expanded in Defiance, where Raziel alludes to the fact that by feeding himself, he's also feeding the Elder God. Not only that, but the game introduces the Archon enemy, which proves the Elder God has other agents to feed him. Raziel once again goes through the caverns and arrives at the swamp, and as I mentioned, it's infested by mutants, while the path to the mountain is open. And though Raziel's progress is hindered by hunter and demon alike, he passes through the ruined remains of Ustenheim, the place Janos Audrin supposedly terrorized, until the Seraphim took him out, and eventually arrives to a flooded canyon with a ruined balcony high up on the mountainside, clearly the home of a winged vampire, more specifically, Janos Audrin's Eyrie. Seeing no way up, Raziel decides to move on, but then Kain arrives and they have a pleasant exchange, a rarity between them, with Raziel complaining that with Kain arriving, something monumentally bad is about to happen, which makes Kain genuinely chuckle and promise no drama this time. He comments on the little prank Mobius played on him, sending him to the future, wondering if perhaps the intent was to harden Raziel's resolve against Kain. The Wraith says he doesn't need hardening, that if he even suspected killing Kain would make a difference, he'd do it, prompting another bout of humor from Kain, telling Raziel, almost proudly, that he knew his former lieutenant would see past their manipulation. He then confirms for Raziel that Janos is indeed important, but that he'll need to find a way to the past on his own. But he warns Raziel that they are in danger, that forces are being moved against them by their enemies. Raziel tells Kain that almost sounds like the two of them are allies, and the fact is, Kain explains, to their enemies, they are. He calls them irritants, troublemakers basically. Raziel admits that they certainly want to get rid of Kain, considering how many demands for his head he's received. Whatever Kain's edge of the coin plan may be, Raziel thinks it got their enemies terrified. But as for him, he thinks they made a mistake in allowing his return, and that perhaps they don't know how to kill him. Meaning Raziel is once again being very arrogant, and once again, Kain has to remind him to not underestimate their opponents. Raziel wonders who the mysterious they and them are, because if it's a conspiracy, the different parts of it don't seem to be in sync, which is true, because as far as they know it's a single enemy. In truth, it's two major forces, the Hilden and the Elder God. Raziel says that even Mobius doesn't seem to know what the hell is going on, and Kain drops a big hint for Raziel. Only the Wraith doesn't pick it up right then. That Mobius is just another pawn. One of their pawns, the irony being that Nosgoth's great manipulator is in fact being manipulated himself. And at this point, Raziel knows who's playing Mobius' strings, who the mastermind is. But if he's acknowledged it, he doesn't say anything. Raziel mentions that these enemies don't like them unwriting history, but Kain corrects him and says they've merely rewritten it, reminding him that history is resilient, and in having a paradox, and given that history doesn't like those, now they've become irritants in this regard as well. And when Raziel asks, what are the consequences of a paradox when the deck can't be shuffled? Kain says in this circumstance, it's the irritants who are removed. Or perhaps that's what their enemies want. And imagine that, a paradox happens, history is trained to account for it, it can't, so Raziel and Kain are removed, swept from the board, their destinies never to be fulfilled. Sounds like a day of celebration for their enemies. Raziel's next stop is another forge, this one for the elemental power of air. And if there ever was a need for more confirmation that the Forgotten City was of vampire origin, here it is, as the forge is very much Aztec-like in construction, much like the Forgotten City has Aztec architecture. Not only that, but the altar where the Reaver is imbued is shaped like a snake head. This forge, much like the Light Forge before it, is a step up in puzzle difficulty, with multiple sections to be completed, involving collecting color-coded hearts and placing them in writhing undead bodies, whereupon a vampire head stone effigy devours their souls and unleashes a torrent of air towards the main forge. And much like the Light Forge, which had sections that required the use of the Dark Reaver, this one requires you to use both light and dark to complete the puzzles, along with a generous amount of platforming and combat. I really like this forge. This forge also has something else that is important. In the previous ones, Raziel studies murals showing the history of the winged beings, in particular their war against their old enemy, the Hilden. But this forge shows the aftermath of the war, and Raziel understands that the winged ones are the first vampires. their bloodlust the result of a curse placed on them by their enemies. He also wonders what Kain's plan is and why Mobius and the forces he serves, which is a phrase that tells you Raziel has not put it all together yet. In fact, he says so himself. He doesn't know how all the puzzle pieces fit yet, but he wonders why the insistence on making him Kain's executioner. If we go by purely power and Kain's unique attributes, especially the Heart of Darkness, then ripping his soul from his body, likely with the use of a Soul Reaver blade, might be the only way to kill him, though it makes sense that everyone and their pawns try to get Raziel to do the deed. The trip back is once again filled with peril, but Raziel manages to reach the swamp and the cracked threshold of that other time-streaming chamber. And now, with the Air Reaver, he can destroy it, head inside and use the machine. Very much with an attitude of, let's see where this one goes, as he has no clue how to set the machine. Might have been worth asking Kain for some tips. But he does make it to the pass, and even Raziel is wise enough at this point to realize this is too convenient. But ultimately doesn't care if this was Mobius or someone else. It's Mobius, 100% Mobius. Raziel, resolved to meet Janos, makes his way through the frozen swamp, because every time period requires a different weather, and the past is winter. It's also a good metaphor. The first section is idyllic, a world full of potential, the perfect place for a new adventure. The future is a stormy weather, chaotic, dangerous, much like the corrupted Nazca. And the far-flung past is frozen, seemingly fixed in place, unmoving, but hiding deep secrets under the sheets of ice. But before Raziel can reach the mountains, he sees for the first time the killing fields of the Sarafan, and finds the experience far more chilling than whatever Mobius' army could do. This is efficient ruthlessness, cold-blooded, demonstrating the dedication that these fanatics had for their craft. After all, the Sarafan were created just to deal with vampires. This is their whole shtick, and it wouldn't be long before Raziel came face to face with the warrior priests themselves, feeling once again a twinge of nostalgia and loss, but no longer seeing the nobility in them. Raziel mentions having seen the human face of vampires, and that could very well mean the fact that the vampires in these periods are much more human in appearance, but it could also be a reference to elements that were ultimately cut from Soul Reaver 2. The first is a cutscene that would have shown a vampire woman being hunted and killed by the hunters, and the other is an entire section above the swamp, a vampire village. Both sections were cut because they didn't feel right for the tone of Soul Reaver 2, and would have shifted sympathies toward vampires too early in the game. The other possibility is that in seeing the origins of the vampire race, and that they had created the pillars, and that their bloodlust and parasitical nature was merely the result of a curse placed on them, much like Raziel felt vampirism was a curse placed on him, he realized vampires are not the monsters he thought they were, and once again feels some kinship with them. Not to mention that the journey, despite whatever Raziel says, had indeed softened him a bit towards his former master, Kain. Raziel reaches the canyon again, only now the water in it is frozen, and above, the area is intact. And though he doesn't know if Janos is even around, he moves on. The area seems impenetrable, but underwater you see the familiar shift glyph on a rock wall, so of course the way opens in the spectral realm. And this leads to the inside of the sanctum, but not to Janos himself. Instead, it's something of a giant puzzle area, with multiple pieces, and the goal is to pour blood on some specific tiles that create bloodstone? Sure, let's call it bloodstone stairs that take you to the upper floors, and eventually to the balcony where you meet Janos. Unfortunately, to charge the Reaver with the required elemental font, Raziel has to use the Air Reaver to blast a hole to the outside, creating an entrance the Sarafan would follow through eventually. When Janos sees our protagonist, he recognizes him immediately and is horrified by his state, wondering what had been done to him. Raziel says he's been dragged to hell and back, all to reach this meeting, but he still doesn't understand the point of it all. Janos explains that when the pillars were erected, when they bound the hill into their prison, there were 9 guardians, 1 for each pillar, but also a 10th for the Reaver. He explains that with time, the race dwindled and eventually was forgotten by the humans, who now viewed them as monsters, and Janos as the origin of the vampire plague as they called it. He also confirms what Vorador said, that only he remains, sustained by his guardianship, but when asked by Raziel about the other guardians, he says he doesn't know why they weren't similarly sustained. Given what we know of the vampires after the binding and the immortality provided by the curse, there's a good chance the Guardians elected to cease to be, tormented by the rejection of their deity, the Elder God. But this is a topic further explored in Defiance. On a related note, Raziel asks why the Pillars chose humans if they were meant to serve vampires, and Janos explains what we already know. The Pillars choose Guardians at birth, and vampires are no longer born, and sadly, full of fear and ignorance, the Circle of Nine with their crusade are killing the very architects of the Pillars. Raziel says Janos must hate humans, but he doesn't. The Ancient knows they're ignorant. They don't understand and they fear and hate that, and their lack of enlightenment means they're very susceptible to manipulation. He shows Raziel how the Sarafan flaunt their kills to either anger him or draw him out. And Raziel mentions how they're amassing forces in the village, which is not true. The village barely has any enemies. But back on the subject of humans, Raziel says Vorador certainly hates them, but Janos replies that Vorador has suffered much by their hand, so he can't forgive them. Raziel then comes to the meat of the subject and asks if he's some form of unholy vampire messiah. Janos says no to the unholy bit, but messiah? Maybe, despite Raziel hating the word, saying it smells of martyrdom to him. But Janos explains Raziel's role is far more benevolent than he's allowed himself to think. He says the binding must be preserved and the Pillars are the lock, and now it clicks for Raziel. Why, there's a guardian for the Reaver, and he states the Reaver is the key. What exactly they meant by the Reaver being the key to the binding has never been fully explained or explored, unfortunately. Janos shows Raziel the blade, and he doesn't feel anything from it. Furthermore, Janos explains their smiths imbued the blade with vampiric qualities, so that it drained their foes of their lifeblood, not their souls, their blood. Still, Raziel feels uneasy, at the same time repulsed and compelled to take it. But ultimately, he asks Janos to take it away from him. Unfortunately, this is when the Sarafan decide to make their dramatic entrance. To protect Raziel, Janos teleports him into another chamber, the Fire Forge. And through the door, Raziel can hear Janos fighting his attackers. The Fire Forge is a single room with puzzles around lighting fires and keeping them lit as the area is flooded in blood, with some of it pouring from gargoyles. Despite its short length, I really like the Fire Forge, and in fact it's short and sweet and just the right length after the very long puzzle gauntlet on the way to meeting Janos. It's perfect. Returning to Janos' chamber, Raziel comes back just as the Sarafan warriors rip the heart from Janos' body. And who will be doing the deed but his human self? Their gazes meet, and the human Raziel is shocked, perhaps a glint of recognition in his eyes, before his other brothers snap him back to attention and they run. And we see one of them holding Mobius' snake staff, likely the reason they were able to defeat Janos in the first place. The balcony begins to shake and the Sarafan escape with the heart and the Reaver blade. Raziel rushes to the gasping and dying Janos, begging him for his forgiveness. But Janos says it's okay. This was probably his true purpose, to save Raziel this one time, with a grieving Raziel telling him that in exchange, he's taking Janos's. Of course, Janos doesn't know Raziel is referring to his mortal self, taking responsibility and the guilt for the actions of the Sarafan he once was. Janos urges Raziel to embrace his destiny and reclaim the Reaver, as it was forged for him and him alone, and that without it, there is no hope. Raziel comes full circle to that moment in Soul Reaver, when he first finds the tomb of the Sarafan, how he refers to them as merely murderers. He's filled with a sense of deep self-loathing and rejects any relation to that other Raziel, to the Sarafan and their crusade. And in Janos' honor, he decides he will embrace the destiny the Ancient had safeguarded for him. And he knew what to do. Pursue the Sarafan and kill them all, retrieve the blade and then the heart and restore Janos. The balcony collapses, but Raziel makes it out before he's crushed by the rocks and starts the journey back to the Sarafan fortress, in pursuit of his human self and the Reaver blade. And this is where his enemies throw everything but the kitchen sink at him, in the form of every single demon so far, along with the truly dangerous red demons and a couple of black ones that are very much #gig clones, hardier and stronger than the red ones, and they throw them at you in packs. Fortunately for you, you have enough health now that letting the Reaver rip maxing it out for insta-kills is a valid strategy, especially with some of the frankly unfair encounters they throw at you. Raziel makes a pit stop at the underground chamber beneath the pillars for one last tete-a-tete with the Elder God. To get there, he must climb a large statue in the caverns, before now only seen while swimming around it. This big stony boy has been confirmed to be an effigy of the Elder God, constructed by an ancient civilization. And it's likely not the vampires who were not aware of the Elder God's true appearance. Or any appearance for that matter. The Elder God berates Raziel for failing him, and Raziel not only ignores him, but asks, was the Elder God really responsible for raising him? Or was he just there at the right time to claim that he did, and take advantage of the gullible and seemingly indestructible newborn wraith? He does admit that he's constantly falling for the manipulations of others, used by them over and over, but somehow always manages to stray beyond their path. Wondering what it is about him that makes him such an unreliable tool for others, and how he manages to survive every trial put in front of him. On and on, a constant sequence of humiliating deaths and resurrections. He realizes there is more to his destiny and his history that he's aware of, or that even the Elder God is aware of. And if you're wondering about the nature of the Elder God, in this time, he's barely a little squid, only a few short tentacles and a single eye. He's not had the time to grow and feed off Nosgoth as fully as he would in the future. After all, in the time period between the start of Soul Reaver 2 and the events of Blood Omen, there are so many deaths and catastrophic events that the Elder God must have gorged himself on the souls of the deceased and grown very big. Raziel makes his triumphant return to the Sarafan fortress and eventually finds the Reaver, but also Mobius and Malik. Mobius swiftly disables the Wraithblade, telling Raziel he's not the idiot he's led Raziel to believe, and that they have unfinished business. And Raziel realizes Mobius knew he would lead the Sarafan to Janos, that the Time Streamer's been orchestrating his every move, and says as much to the Time Guardian, to which Mobius gives a sinister chuckle. Raziel asks if his destiny is amusing to Mobius, and the Time Streamer admits it was, while it lasted. Raziel attempts to get closer, but Malik stands in his way, and Mobius instructs the Paladin to not let Raziel leave. He then asks Raziel if he really thought he was good enough to change time on Mobius? He's the Time Streamer, he says. He knew Raziel's every move before he knew it himself. This is a blatant lie, but Raziel, if anything, has proven very gullible. And then we hear the bits of dialogue from the intro of Blood Omen.
They can feast on your corpses!
When Vorador is assaulting the circle. Malik wants to hurry to their side, but Mobius stops him, warning him that the real danger is Raziel. Mobius continues his verbal assault, calling Raziel toxic, asking if the Wraith really thought Mobius would allow him to go freely and corrupt everything he touched. Raziel admits to underestimating Mobius, but says that is a mistake he would not repeat. To which Mobius says, wrong again, before leaving and instructing Malik to bolt the door. Raziel, without the Wraithblade, has to pick up the Reaver, and from here, can't drop it. You can't use any other weapon except the Reaver. He also comments on how he can feel the Wraithblade vainly attempting to coil around its physical self, but unable to do so because of the staff. Leaving the room, we see the last bit of Mobius' orchestration for Raziel by putting Melchiah, Sephon, Rahab, Duma, and Turel in his path. All there for Raziel to take out with the Reaver. When you kill them, their souls shoot upwards, you can't consume them. And Raziel realizes that it was him that put these Sarafan bodies in the ground for Kain to raise later on. Also, while wielding the Reaver, you're very much invulnerable, and so much like the finale of Soul Reaver, the final encounters in Soul Reaver 2 are impossible to fail. The journey ends in that same memorial room, and Raziel faces himself both metaphorically and literally, and at the end kills the human Raziel, telling him,
I renounce you.
And then the other shoe drops. The effect of the staff conveniently ends, and the Wraithblade uncoils itself around the physical sword, fully disentangling itself from Raziel, no longer bound to him symbiotically, which frightens Raziel more than it ever did in the past when it was bound to him. And the conjoined blades, one bloodthirsty and the other soul-hungry, with no other targets in the vicinity, turn themselves on Raziel. And in this moment, the pieces finally click into place for him. why the Reaver blade, when offered by Janos, didn't give him that vertigo sensation, and why it shattered when Kain tried to strike him down. Because the ravenous soul-eating spirit within the sword was always Raziel himself. Raziel struggles in vain to resist the newly made Soul Reaver, because the vampiric blade is simply the Reaver. It's only a Soul Reaver when you add those little sprinkles of Raziel on top. Kain appears before him and Raziel asks if this is the destiny he had planned. Kain urges Raziel to give in, to let it happen. And despite his best efforts, Raziel can't hold on. And as he's being consumed, in that moment when his soul is both inside and outside the sword at the same time, that paradox displacement manifests in full force, and Raziel has another realization. This is the edge of the coin, the paradox moment Kain gambled everything on. Kain steps forward, grips the blade, and rips it out of Raziel. And immediately, the world shakes and heaves at Kain's choice in this moment. And as the memories flood Kain's mind as this fourth timeline is created, Raziel wonders, given the look of sheer horror on Kain's face, if they had pushed history too far this time and created a fatal paradox. Kain, with new insight, says,
The Hilden! We walked right into their trap. Raziel, Janos must stay dead.
But Raziel had already faded, slipping into the spectral realm, too weak to stay in the physical world. And to his anguish, waiting for him there, once again bound symbiotically, was his twin soul, the Wraith Blade. And he knows he's merely postponed the inevitable. He could never escape this loop, his destiny. After all, history abhors a paradox. The first time I played this game, the fact he is the one who killed the Seraphon version of the Vampire Brethren always struck me as a bit of poetic justice. Raziel spent so much time condemning Kain for his sick joke of reviving Seraphon as vampires, but it turns out Raziel is as complicit by preparing things for Kain to even get the chance for that little joke, especially because he very much gleefully kills them, or at the very least doesn't give a damn about it. And then the revelations of why the Reaver blade was destroyed and what the Soul Reaver really is are amazing. They blew my mind at the time. It's especially good when, if you pay attention, you realize that none of the older vampires call it the Soul Reaver but the Reaver. And then Janos explains it's a vampiric blade, so given what's happened in Soul Reaver 2 up to that point, you begin to suspect that maybe, just maybe, there's something else at play. And you may even guess that the Soul Reaver is made from consuming Raziel. I certainly didn't. Soul Reaver 2 took me for a ride. And despite their best intentions, once again the lack of a proper ending hurt the reviews for Soul Reaver 2. Especially because they promised there would be one. It's too much of a cliffhanger and open ending to consider it a satisfying conclusion to the story. As for the Hilden, I'll go a bit deeper on them during my Blood Omen 2 retrospective, but there were communications between the two teams, but only to make sure the art was kept consistent. And that final line of the Hilden, we fell into their trap, and the paradox spawning another timeline were the way Amy Hennig intended to explain Blood Omen 2's very existence. And of course, that of its gaping plot holes, specifically Vorador and Janos Audron. With Soul Reaver 2 in place, those elements are a product of Kain's choice and this massive paradox. Does it work? We'll talk more about that in the Blood Omen 2 and Defiance retrospectives. And so ends Soul Reaver 2, a game that is much heavier in terms of the depth of its storytelling than its predecessor, and very much sets the stage for whatever comes next. I hope you enjoyed this look at Soul Reaver 2. I hope you'll join me for the next entry into the series of retrospectives, as we dive into the black sheep of the family, Blood Omen 2. See you then.